feedback. So today we have a great lineup of speakers. Let me give a quick round of introductions. We have Katie Bolduc. Katie is an Assistant Director of International Affairs and Trade at the U.S. Accountability Office. And we have Bridget Savino. Bridget is a Senior Program Analyst at the United States Government Accountability Office. Katie and Bridget actually contributed a report on transnational repression, which is published in October 2023. And this report actually covers the transnational repression in the context of the United States and provide a deep analysis of what are the loopholes and provide some policy recommendations. So you can actually find this report at their webpage. And our third speaker, Edward Lemon. Edward is the president of Oxford Society of Central Asian Affairs, and he is also a research professor at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. So Edward studies transnational repression with a focus on post-Soviet Central Asian governments, Russia and China. And the last but not the least, we have Süleyman Özaran. He's a professorial lecturer at American University in Washington, D.C., and also he's a senior fellow at Orion Policy Institute. Today with Süleyman and a team of researchers at Orion Policy Institute, we published a report late last year, and we actually provided a global perspective of transnational repression and tried to bring some policy implications for the civil society and also the policymakers. And we are going to have individual presentations about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we are going to have a Q&A at the end. Please feel free to use Q&A function. Don't wait till the end, so you can enter your questions beforehand. And I would like to kick off our conversation by starting with Katie and talking about the role of Government Accountability Office. And then we are going to dive deep into what are the transnational repression activities and the tactics, especially in the context of United States. So I'll turn the mic over to Katie.
Thank you so much for hosting today's event. Bridget and I and our team back at GAO were happy to have an opportunity to lend our research to further discussion of TNR and to learn from our colleagues here today. So thanks for helping put this session together. As Swat mentioned, before we dive into our research, we wanted to provide a bit of background about GAO and its position in the policy world, stemming from our role as a federally funded and independent element of the legislative branch of the government. We essentially function as a research and policy analysis arm of Congress. And so being situated inside the government, we have direct access to the documents, data, and the officials themselves who are responsible for conducting taxpayer-funded programs and activities. And in that, our primary role is to help Congress provide oversight of agency efforts to implement existing policy and laws. And because we oversee implementation, we don't tend to make recommendations specifically about what those policies ought to be, but rather make recommendations directly to the agencies themselves in order to help make their efforts more effective and more efficient, particularly in using taxpayer-funded dollars. Now, I'll note we do sometimes identify what we call matters for congressional consideration, which read a lot like a recommendation to Congress, but even those tend not to make policy, sort of prescriptive policy suggestions, but rather identify ideas to help improve Congress's capacity to conduct oversight. And I mention those both because you'll hear both of those stemming from our TNR research here today. So while GAO's purview extends to the entirety of the federal taxpayer funded activities, we as the GAO certainly don't have the resources to watch every single one of those dollars all the time. And so we focus our efforts on areas of particular interest to members of Congress. And in this instance, we received a request from 10 members of the House of Representatives to address certain aspects of TNR. And with that request in hand, we designed research focused on 3 questions that are up on the screen now. So I won't read them specifically, but generally, it was a review of agency efforts to collect data and learn about the nature and prevalence of TNR, a review of agency efforts to address and use the tools at their disposal to address TNR, and then a specific look at one element of the Arms Export Control Act, or AECA, which prohibits arms transfers to countries that the president has determined to be engaged in a consistent pattern of harassment and intimidation against individuals inside the United States. So it's a very specifically worded statute that we'll unpack a little bit here, but while it was drafted decades ago at this point, it clearly contemplates part of the problem set that we recognize as TNR today. So we took a look at that specific part of law. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Bridget to dig into our research a little bit here and stand at the ready for discussion a little bit later and to help answer questions.
Thanks, Katie. So for that first question on the collection and analysis of information about transnational repression, or TNR, against US-based persons, we found that agencies and nonprofits have been making some good efforts to collect information on TNR incidents and even identify some common perpetrators. And in particular, we identified 3 main reports looking at this issue, which we have here on the slide in this Venn diagram. So in the bottom left, the State Department in February 2022 issued a diplomatic and consular cable that identified the most frequent offenders of TNR against individuals both in the US and in other countries. And then moving to the right in green, the Department of Homeland Security in October 2022 did an assessment of routine perpetrators of transnational repression against US-based persons, and they shared that assessment in the federal agency community. And then lastly, as I think a lot of you are likely familiar, Freedom House is well regarded in this space in terms of collecting information and trying to identify perpetrators. We also reviewed their reports, and here we have the findings from their April 2023 report, and they focus on the most prolific perpetrators of direct physical incidents of TNR worldwide. So each of these 3 reports has a slightly different focus and scope, but there are 5 foreign governments there in the middle, in terms of thematic perpetrators, and those 5 are the People's Republic of China, Iran, Russia, Rwanda, and Turkey. So, while agencies have collected some information on incidents, they did tell us that they are not able to quantify the full extent of the issue, and they identified several challenges to collecting information and trying to, identify common perpetrators. One is that some forms of transnational repression are just inherently hard to detect. For instance, digital transnational repression can often fly under the radar. In addition, victims of transnational repression might be reluctant to report incidents, especially if some of them may be concerned about their immigration status. And then victims also in some incidents might not recognize TNR themselves, either because it is difficult to detect or in some instances it's been normalized in their origin countries. So to help address some of these challenges, federal agencies have undertaken a number of different efforts in the intelligence and analysis sphere. For an example, the FBI did set up a transnational repression cell in 2021 to help the Bureau better identify and counter TNR when it does receive tips. There's also been some community engagement activities at the federal level. So State Department, for instance, and the Department of Homeland Security have held some listening sessions with victims to better understand their experiences. And then there's also been some public outreach at the federal level, and we have a couple of examples here in the slide. Social media that both the DOJ and FBI have put out to help both raise public awareness of what TNR is, and then also provide some resources for victims for how to report those incidents. However, at the end of the day, agencies did tell us that a big hindrance to their tracking cases is a lack of common understanding of transnational repression and what constitutes transnational repression, particularly at the state and local law enforcement levels that are often the first people to encounter victims. So if they're not recognizing that foreign element of some of these crimes, then of course it's not going to be addressed, it's not going to be reported, and they're going to continue to be gaps in federal understanding of the issue. So that did lead to our first recommendation, and that was to the Department of Justice. And we recommended that they should do more to enhance understanding of TNR, both among federal agencies and also state and local law enforcement agencies, such as by conducting additional training or developing an interagency definition of what constitutes transnational repression. Moving on to that second question we looked at on available tools that federal agencies have used. Here we found two main things. So first, we found that the State Department and Treasury Department have both used some administrative penalties, such as visa restrictions and sanctions against these individual perpetrators who are actually carrying out these acts. And then secondly, in the criminal realm, as many of you might know, there aren't currently any laws on the books in the US that specifically criminalize or even define transnational repression. There are some bills that have been introduced in recent years. None of them have yet passed. So DOJ and FBI have been using other statutes to prosecute these acts. So some examples are those against money laundering or murder for hire. And so while they have been able to leverage these other statutes to hold some folks accountable, we did hear from FBI officials in particular that because these statutes are not purpose-built for transnational repression, they are not always sufficient to address the full scope of transnational repression that US-based persons are facing. FBI also told us that they did conduct an informal internal analysis in 2022 over, looking at cases over 2 years of TNR-related incidents, and they did identify several specific gaps in current US law that hinder their efforts. However, the results of that analysis have not been shared in their entirety with Congress or with the administration. In the Department of Justice, when we asked about whether they've submitted a legislative proposal, they told us that those would be necessary first steps before they do submit a legislative proposal. So this led to our second recommendation. We recommended that the DOJ develop and draft a coordinated enterprise-wide position on whether there are indeed gaps, what those gaps are, and then if they deem it appropriate, submit a legislative proposal through the formal channels to address those gaps. And then finally, that third question that Katie mentioned on Section 6 of the AECA. This is one tool that could potentially be used to hold some foreign governments themselves accountable, right, as opposed to the individual perpetrators that are carrying out the acts. Of course, it is limited in scope to those with whom we have a security relationship. So for instance, some perpetrators like China or Iran, this would not be an effective tool since we do not sell arms to them. But for those folks to whom we do sell arms, this prohibits those sales if the president determines they are engaged in these consistent acts. As Katie mentioned, it is restricted to the US, so it has a slightly different scope than those past two questions, which is kind of how FBI and DOJ look at it. US-based persons such as citizens or residents abroad, this is really focused on US domestic soil. The bottom line here is, since it was enacted in 1981, no president has made a determination. In addition, no responsibilities under the statute have been delegated to any agencies. So, oftentimes some responsibilities under statute can be delegated to agencies such as the Department of Defense or State in the case of the AECA. In this case, it hasn't, and that's also not unusual. But in this case, it lies solely with the president, the responsibility. So when we did look into whether maybe it's ever been considered, it was also unclear if it has ever been considered, the extent to which it has been since 1981. And that is in part because the president is not required to make a determination. There isn't any sort of like routine determination, positive or otherwise, he or she is required to make. So just because there hasn't been a determination since 81 doesn't necessarily mean it hasn't been considered. We just don't know. It's not clear. The statute does include a reporting requirement to Congress, but it is only in the event of a positive determination. And because of that, there is this lack of transparency into why no such determinations have been made or the extent to which they've been considered. And we illustrate that with an example here on this next slide. So here we have a map in light brown. Those are the top 25 US arms transfer recipients from fiscal year 2017 to 2021. And then in dark brown, those are the foreign governments that I spoke of earlier in that Venn diagram that have been identified as having committed TNR worldwide. Again, not just solely in the US. And so you can see that there are a few countries that fall into both of those categories, namely Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And combined, they received about 66 billion in this period in arms transfers. But since there is not a requirement that the president report on potential determinations under Section 6, there is limited visibility into the extent to which has ever been considered for these countries or for any others since 1981. So here we did make one of those matters for congressional consideration that Katie mentioned. And we suggested that should Congress want additional visibility into considerations or determinations under this statute, they should consider amending that reporting requirement to Congress. So in the absence of any determinations or, delegated responsibilities, we did try to look at whether what has been done by agencies related to transnational repression in the context of arms transfers. And here we found, perhaps unsurprisingly, that none of them have done any work related to implementing Section 6, such as collecting, analyzing, sharing information on transnational repression for the specific purposes of making a determination. Again, they aren't required to. It was also unclear the extent to which they've used Section 6 as a deterrent, such as, maybe within diplomatic conversations with these foreign governments, noting the fact that this particular statute exists, those sorts of things. We didn't find any evidence of that. And also, we found that no arms transfers have been halted even temporarily on account of transnational repression, say, as a part of other arms transfer vetting procedures, like for human rights violations. However, towards the end of our audit, state officials did tell us that they are developing 2 new measures to consider TNR in the context of arms transfers. So first of all, they told us that they are actually developing procedures with respect to Section 6. And that was actually, they told us in part due to the GAO's audits. They didn't have specifics at the time, but they said, it might perhaps include sharing information related to TNR or guidance on how and when to engage with other agencies or the White House on matters related to Section 6. And then secondly, they are developing some new tools and guidance to implement the new conventional arms transfer policy, which came out in February of last year, 2023. And that particular policy does require the US government to consider the risk that an arms transfer can contribute to TNR. So that's the second process that they are developing with regard to TNR in the context of arms transfers. So here we did make 2 more recommendations directed at the State Department. We recommended that they include steps to coordinate with and collect information from other agencies, such as DHS and DOJ, that we know are collecting such information when they do develop those new 2 procedures. And here on this last slide, we just have a summary of all of those recommendations, the 2 to DOJ, 2 to state, and then the matter for Congress. So that concludes the summary of our report. I do have a couple of contact emails here. And again, we can answer questions at the end. And if you're interested in reading the full report, it's on gao.gov. So I'll turn it over to you, Suhat. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And Bridget, you provided a good kind of insights about what's going on in the US context. And it's great to see like there are some developments, especially in improving the awareness, but also there are so much room for, especially for legal procedures, and also like from the perspective of executive branch, how to actually enact these policies. Thanks a lot. Okay, thank you. So would you please unshare the screen? Okay, thanks a lot. So now I would like to actually provide a kind of a global outlook, a brief introduction of what's going on. So I'm going to zoom out, and then I'm going to leave it to Ed to talk about China's transnational repression activities, and then Shaiman will talk about a kind of loopholes at the global level and provide some case studies. And Bridget talked about the data set from Freedom House. So it's really important, especially to improve the awareness. So there are so much resources they allocated, and what they found is that more than 800 physical transnational repression incidents that happened between 2013 and 2022. And this includes detention, rendition, unlawful deportation, unknown disappearances, and also like some physical attacks, assassinations, assassination attempts, assaults, and this also includes intimidation and the threats. So when we look at the overall map, these are mostly authoritarian states, and these top countries are, not surprisingly, as we know, like China, Russia, Iran, and Turkey. China especially targeting the Uyghur communities, and also we see Russia going after the regime opponents, and also we see Iran going their diaspora in different countries, and also Turkey is going after the members of Gülen movement, and also the Kurdish activists, and also some leftist activists, and also like the journalists. So this is a kind of the trend that the perpetrator of transnational repression is pretty much coming from this authoritarian, or we can say quasi-democratic state. And also Bridget talked about this number is actually undercounting the overall picture. So we cannot see especially digital transnational repression here. And also there is an awareness problem, especially from the victim side. They may not be aware that they are actually the victim. Even they are aware, they can actually be, they have fear of reporting these incidents. Even they report, so they may not be, the agencies and the law enforcement may not be actually capable of this reporting or bringing some action to prevent such repressive activities. So it's also important to look at where these incidents are happening. So again, from the Freedom House data, there are 91 countries. So it is much more a spread out location. And we see Thailand, Russia, Turkey is among them. And when we look at the picture, we see like these repressive activities mostly happening in authoritarian or developing countries, with unlawful deportation, detention, and rendition. Especially these perpetrator countries can actually co-opt with the agencies and the institutions, so they can easily reach out to diaspora and the activists with their long arms. But also we have the democratic countries that are the hosting nations of TNR. That includes many European countries, including the United States, and also like Bridget and Katie talk about in detail. So when it comes to the TNR activities from these perpetrator countries, especially with these democratic countries, we see these groups using diaspora members, pro-regime diaspora members going after the dissidents, and also activists, and also like ethnic and religious groups. And also they can use criminal networks and the gangs, for example, so they can actually use this kind of proxies to assault, to intimidate, and provide some level of espionage about these activists and also diaspora members. So I would like to briefly talk about Turkey as a case study, because it is It is among the top origin and the top host nations of TNR. Turkey especially increased its TNR activities after 2016. And what we see that Turkey is not shying away to not sharing what they do. For example, they actually shared the data that they arrested more than 100 people in 27 countries. And these people actually pretty much shown on the local media and, you know, the national TV. And the Turkey is proud of their TNR activities. So when it comes to developing countries like in Central Asia, in Africa, what we see that Turkey using intelligence agencies and their diplomats to have a kind of collaboration with the state officials to bring those people for political reasons. And these are just extrajudicial and political reasons to bring these people. But Turkey used this as a kind of counterterrorism or counter-corruption operations. So when it comes to the democratic countries, especially the European countries, what we see Turkey using pro-AKP diaspora members, especially in Germany, Sweden, to intimidate and also to initiate some physical attacks against especially journalists. And also Turkey using some government agencies, for example, Diyanet, which is the Directorate of Religious Affairs, which is funded by Turkish government. And there are imams in these institutions. And there was an investigation by the German government against these imams, some of these imams, for spying against the diaspora members, especially the opponents of the AKP regime. And so there are some examples that the AKP government can actually co-opt with some criminal groups and the gangs. So there was another investigation in 2017 in Germany that Turkey actually, AKP government, worked with Ottoman Germania, which is a gang group, criminal gang group, to go after these diaspora members. And also we see that, you know, there are like variety of tools and instruments. So these governments, including Turkey, can use like the family members and the relatives in the home country as a long distance threat. So they can actually coerce, and they can use some intimidation, fear, and even detention to actually bring these activists to Turkey and, you know, force them to return themselves to authorities, at least to suppress their activists activities on social media or in person. And also what we see, especially what Turkey has been doing, is abusing the Interpol stolen and lost travel document system. Turkey made thousands of requests, and this request actually saying that the passports are canceled or lost. So try to actually mitigate the mobility of these diaspora members. And also there are several reports that these individuals were actually denied to have consular services, like renewing their passports and, you know, to be able to travel outside of Turkey. So this is an example of how Turkey has been using TNR activities to suppress the dissident voices. It is not only against the activists, but being a member of a social group or an ethnic group is sufficient enough for being a target from the Turkish government. And also, Turkey has been using a variety of sources, including agencies and also diaspora members, and also like the criminal networks, to be able to suppress the freedom of life and also freedom of speech, especially for those who are running away from their country to have a kind of a better life and, you know, exercise their human rights. So I want to actually stop here, and I'm going to turn it over to Ed to talk about the China, another case study, and especially how China is targeting Uyghurs. And
thanks, Guat, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this important event today. So Turkey, of course, is one of the primary states that is, as Suat said, both a host and a perpetrator of transnational repression. China is quite possibly the largest user of transnational repression globally. And today I'm going to talk about particularly their targeting of the Uyghur community. As many people know, over the past decades or even centuries, the government of China has brutally suppressed the local population, the indigenous population of Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, China's westernmost province, population that is largely Turkic ethnicity, Turkic-speaking groups, Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and Kyrgyz, Uyghurs being the largest of those groups, a Muslim population. And many people are familiar with the network of over 380 detention camps and the over 1 million individuals who've gone through this process of re-education that was started about a decade ago by the Chinese Communist Party. But today I'm going to talk about the way in which this campaign against Uyghurs and other Turkic groups is in fact global in nature. And I'm going to draw on a data set that we've built. The Uyghur diaspora is distributed in different parts of the world, the largest group being in Kazakhstan, almost 300,000 individuals, country that's bordering Xinjiang, other significant diasporas in other parts of Central Asia, Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. Turkey, because of its historic links and linguistic affinities with the Uyghur people, is the largest center of the diaspora outside of Central Asia. But there are also significant populations now who've arrived in more recent years in the United States and in the European Union. And so today I'm going to speak a little bit about a data set that we built in 2021. It was a collaboration between myself, Bradley Jardin, and Natalie Hall at Oxford Society with partners at the Uyghur Human Rights Project. And we created a data set of 7,108 cases of Uyghurs being targeted outside of China between the first case that we recorded in 1997 and when we stopped collecting data in 2021. So the single largest data set of transnational repression published to date. It's an event data set, so individuals can appear multiple times. It's coded around specific cases of people being targeted. And for reasons already mentioned, of course, like any data set, this is not complete. It's based on open sources. It's based on existing other data sets, such as Freedom House's data set, such as Alex Dukalskis's Authoritarian Actors Abroad data set, and reports by human rights organizations, media reports in local languages, and is an attempt to build as complete a picture of the trends that we're seeing, but in no way as a complete picture of the scale of this problem, given the reasons we've already mentioned. We relied on both mass cases where we saw mass detentions or mass targeting through cyber attacks, and that gave us an upper estimate, which is the 7,108 cases. And then we gave a lower estimate of the number of cases based on cases that we have very specific information, people's names, people's biographical details, so we could build up a bigger picture. And that number that we could build up a bigger picture is much smaller, around 500. The data set is available for download at the Oxford Society website, so people can download it and look at and map the trends for themselves. And we published a series of other reports that you can find there based on the data. Based on a previous data set, the Central Asia Political Exiles database, which was the first data set created on transnational repression based out of the University of Exeter, we developed this three-stage model, or we followed their three-stage model. The first stage is when an exile or member of the diaspora is put on notice. They maybe receive warnings or threats, and this is cyber attacks and so on and so forth. The next stage is that they're arrested or detained abroad, often at the request of their home government. And then finally, in the third most serious stage, they're either formally extradited, informally rendered, they disappear, or they're attacked or assassinated. Now, not everyone goes through all of those three stages. That process isn't always linear, but obviously we're going from these more everyday practices to the more exceptional practices. And within our data set, the largest number of cases we see is in this former, or the first stage, which is kind of more everyday practices. And we see a division between those more exceptional practices being in authoritarian states. As Suat said, it's the cases of extradition, assassination, and disappearances that we've seen have primarily taken place in authoritarian states, where a member of the diaspora is able to reach a liberal democracy such as the United States. There's more of a reliance on these stage 1 type measures. Over time, we've seen the scale of this problem increasing. So whereas we can say in the first period between 1997, when we saw the first observation, and 2014, which is when China launched its Strike Hard campaign in Xinjiang and really intensified its repression in that area. We've seen a mass proliferation, both in the scale of this and in its geographic spread. So you can see in the first period between 1997 and 2014, we only see 238 incidents, whereas we see 6,870 events in the period since between 2014 and 2021. So as you can see from the geographic spread, it's increasing. In terms of the countries that appear most frequently in the data set, Europe, due to some mass cases of the targeting of the Uyghur World Congress, for example, that's based in Munich in Germany. Europe appears most frequently. These are almost all stage 1 cases. They're primarily digital, transnational repression, cyber attacks, harassment online, and these kind of practices. Southwest Asia, particularly India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, are home to another large number of cases. Again, some stage 1, others in stage 2. And then the Middle East and North Africa, and the rest of the world has 775 and 1,152 cases in the data set, as you can see. Countries that are particular sites of this repression, as we've mentioned, include Germany, which is home to a significant Uyghur diaspora, and the Uyghur World Congress, which has been very vocal in its criticism of the Chinese Communist Party. Turkey, that has a 50,000 plus strong diaspora group, primarily living in Istanbul. Due to those historic ties, has also been a key site for China to perpetrate these practices. Egypt, particularly a mass incident in 2017 in Al-Azhar University, one of the prime seats of learning in the Islamic world. There was a mass targeting of students, Uyghur students who were studying Islam in that university, many of whom were sent messages by the Chinese government encouraging them to return home. And when they returned home, many of them were unfortunately detained. Thailand's another key site for this practice to happen. Thailand has become one of the key routes for people escaping China to transit through, and the Thai authorities have in many cases detained those individuals and in some cases deported them back to China. And Kazakhstan, home to the world's largest diaspora, has also appeared quite prominently in this data. What's driving this increasing proliferation in China's use of transnational repression? Well, of course, quite a lot of the story is what's happening in Xinjiang itself, with the launching of this Strike Hard campaign and the People's War on Terror shortly after Xi Jinping came to power in 2014, and the introduction of this re-education camp system, this creation of this digital police state with the mass surveillance, forced sterilization, closure of mosques, and suppression of the Uyghur, other Turkic languages. So whilst we've seen repression at home, that of course has pushed people out of the area, and we've seen growing levels of migration, people seeking refuge abroad, and we've seen this desire to police those individuals and target them even after they've left the country. Of course, as with transnational repression more generally, with the growth of new technologies, particularly new forms of malware and other tools, even AI-enabled tools now to track and model people's behavior, have formed key tools for China to target individuals overseas. Of course, as China's developed its Belt and Road Initiative and it's continued to rise as an investor and a trader in different parts of the world, these strengthening bilateral ties with different countries such as Turkey, such as Pakistan, with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, that's one of the major corridors of Belt and Road Initiative. We've seen in many ways a quid pro quo relationship developing, whereby certain investments and other things are offered, and this we see, and there is some documentary evidence that we have this, an agreement that as a result of this aid and assistance, there will be some condition around not allowing Uyghurs and other opposition groups to operate within the country. And we see China also operating, as we say, in concert with other authoritarian countries through various international institutions, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that includes Russia, China, Central Asian republics, India, and Pakistan. And of course, like other countries, through institutions like Interpol. And so Suat's already mentioned some of the mechanisms that Turkey uses. China's approach is somewhat similar. Of course, there are a number of actors who are key practices that are key to China's use of transnational repression. Of course, the security apparatuses in the United Front Work Department, which is charged, the CCP body that's charged with relations with overseas Chinese and people living, people of Chinese origin or Chinese citizenship living abroad. It's tasked with surveilling them, making sure they don't form any opposition threat to the party back in the mainland. And so they've been very active in perpetrating many of these practices against the Uyghur community. Of course, as with Turkey, we see the recruitment of informants and spies within the diaspora community. We've seen various forms of digital surveillance and, for example, people being texted a link, and then they open the link and it installs malware on their phone. Something we've seen happen. We've seen also smear campaigns, particularly gendered smear campaigns that have targeted women activists and claiming that they have disgraced their nation, that they've engaged in activities that are immoral, so on and so forth. So all sorts of tactics being used. And of course, also another practice that's seen in other parts of the world of coercion by proxy, or the targeting of relatives living in China. We've seen the use of extradition treaties and legal agreements. As I've said before, China signing extradition treaties with over 40 countries at this point, and using those extradition treaties as a means to expedite the return of Uyghurs living overseas, and multilateral institutions as well, including the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Interpol. And so with that, I'll conclude. And interested to hear other perspectives and questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Ed, for especially collecting this data and sharing your insights on your analysis. So this is important. And also we have a question, just because it came to you want to actually expand your data collection to other issues related to TNR. So you can briefly answer this question.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
So there was a question in the chat box saying, would you like to expand your data collection to other TNR activities?
Yes, I think, well, there have been other efforts. As I said, there are a number of existing data sets. There's Alex Dukauskis's data set. As I said, there's the Freedom House data set. Of course, it's always desirable to try and collect and amalgamate these data sets into a larger whole. That would be something I think that would be very useful. I think there are challenges in assembling these data sets, but I think they've been important in showing and mapping the trends. Before we're thinking a decade ago, there was increasing interest in transnational repression. It was in its infancy in many ways, and we had lots of anecdotal and separate cases, but I think this systematic approach has been very useful. And so I think there's certainly scope to look at some of other prominent actors, Russia, Turkey, and build a more comprehensive data set than the one that we have. It's just a matter of, like anything, time and resources, but I think it's definitely helpful to adopt this more data-driven approach.
Thank you, Ed. So I want to turn it over to Süleyman and talk about the general loopholes at the global level, and also I hope he's going to provide also some cases from different regions, and also he's going to provide some policy recommendations. The mic is yours, Süleyman.
It is like a ritual, someone has to remind you that microphone is off. So again, thank you for organizing this event. Thanks to the U.S. Government Accountability Office and the Orion Policy Institute. I feel like I'm lucky, because the previous speakers, presenters have covered a lot of the issues that I was planning to talk about. But I want to elaborate more on some of the issues and hopefully to get some questions. So I think one of the important issues when it comes to transnational repression is the evolving nature of how these actors engage in TNR. We see sort of an evolution of how they target their dissidents in the host countries in terms of the actors engaging in such crimes, the tools that they use, and the targets. One of the issues I think that we should remember, this is not about an issue, a problem between an authoritarian regime and the target, a victim. I think it is much bigger than that. It is also, the target also includes the governments, the host countries' governments are also targets. The communities of host countries are also targets. So that is why I think the governments, the security apparatus of the host countries should take this much more seriously than just, the one government is targeting the dissident living in the host country. So, so when we look at the these countries targeting their opposition figures, dissidents, activists, academia, and journalists living in diaspora. I'm going to use the terminology that we use in cybersecurity, which is a threat actor. In this case, obviously the main threat actor is the country, the authoritarian regime, but because it is the government, which means they have unlimited resources, and they can change their practices, they can make it much more sophisticated. And we see as sort of a pattern, the previous speakers have already provided a lot of insights, but I think there is sort of an escalation from the use of transnational, digital transnational repression techniques through social media and the like, to intimidation, physical attacks, even attempts of assassinations and assassinations. This trend is very concerning because there is sort of a diffusion effect, meaning these regimes learn from each other, and they also observe how the target or host country's government react to these kinds of illegal activities. And if they see no or very little response, then they escalate. The tactics escalate into, again, violent behaviors. So I think one of the very interesting trends is how they work with the proxy actors in terms of crime as a service. And both Bridget and Edward and also Suad provided us with many examples. It is very concerning because they kind of use anyone, they can buy out or pay for the service. This could change, or this could be, for example, drug traffickers, gang members, or anyone with a criminal history, which would be much more complicated and difficult for the law enforcement agencies to detect unless they have a prior intelligence. So this evolution, from just an ordinary problem between one government and a dissident to a much more sophisticated, sort of a criminal, almost like a criminal syndicate, tells us, that we need to take this much more seriously than we are at this moment. I think one of the problems in terms of how these governments have been able to facilitate these illegal activities is the fact that, unfortunately, there is no universally recognized legal frameworks and principles. As Bridget explained in a great detail, the United States seems to be taking some initiatives and trying to take this much more seriously. I think we need a global scale awareness. The loopholes enable the authoritarian regimes to go after the dissidents, to leverage the systems that exist to fight against crime, like terrorism, like cybercrime, like human trafficking. And a typical example is, unfortunately, is the use of or abuse of the intergovernmental cooperation platforms such as the Interpol. Interpol is a typical, again, an example of how such regimes have been abusing and exploiting the existing systems, the systems that the governments use to fight against other crimes. And these regimes use the very same excuse as a pretext to facilitate, to leverage the Interpol mechanisms such as the red notices or lost and stolen passports and diffusions. Because of the, not lack of, but maybe weak internal oversight mechanisms existed within the Interpol, they have been able to facilitate those. Imagine a Western democratic regime, a country, a host country, extraditing an individual just because a government of like China, Iran, or Russia, or Turkey submitted a request. And because of these loopholes in the system, such governments have been successful, getting back these individuals in a very tragic way. So what do we need? Again, this applies to other governments in the world, not just the United States. I think we need a paradigm shift, and now, traditionally governments consider national security issues within the framework of if a foreign state engages in espionage activity, or if there's an attack, against the territorial integrity or sovereignty, or established international humanitarian law or norms. But I think there is a need to change that, to shift from this traditional perspective into a sort of understanding that the transnational repression requires a very different looking into this problem, meaning the governments should recognize this threat as a matter of national security. Again, I'm going to just repeat, transnational repression is not an issue between a regime that is going after a dissident living in another country. So, as Bridget explained, the United States, different agencies within the U.S. government, such as the FBI, have been taking some steps toward the right direction. The U.S. government, the U.S. Congress has already enacted a law, the Transnational Repression, Accountability and Prevention Act, TRAP, which is basically to prevent any regimes to exploit the Interpol mechanisms in the United States. This is also very crucial. The FBI has been taking this very, very seriously, but I think in terms of the resources, in terms of the extent of the problem, I think there needs to be more resources allocated to the FBI, not just the FBI as a federal agency, but also the state and local law enforcement agencies in the United States. Again, this could also be applied to other governments in the world. I'm going to repeat actually what the common sentiment in this event. I think we need a common language on transnational repression across all the democratic states and other governments. I think international organizations should step up their efforts to make sure that transnational repression is going to be included in the traditionally important issues of security. Other countries should follow the steps of the US Congress to enact a similar law, such as the TRAP Act. I think, again, as a practical measure, the Global Magnitsky Act could also be used by other countries to specifically target the individuals of foreign governments who may be facilitating, coordinating transnational repression activities in other countries. In terms of the Interpol, there are several steps that the Interpol should take to make sure that, again, the existing mechanism cannot be abused and exploited by the foreign governments. First of all, they need to allocate more resources to prevent abusive requests from the government. At this moment, we know that such resources are so limited that unfortunately, mechanisms can be exploited. The Interpol should also develop some an additional oversight mechanism, such as external and transparent supervision models. The Interpol has already had an internal mechanism, but again, an external mechanism is going to enhance the oversight effort. I think the disclosing the number of red notices coming from the countries and disclosing this in a transparent way so that the public would know how many red notices requests came from which countries could also help to, again, make sure the transparency. I think this recommendation is a very commonly repeated, frequently repeated request in many reports. And the report that we published in September 2023 at the Orion Policy Institute, we also emphasize the importance of designating a special rapporteur at the United Nations, focusing on tracking transnational incidents in the world. This would also facilitate or enhance, first of all, the awareness among the nation states, as well as creating common understanding and practices in the world. One of the encouraging steps toward this direction has been taken during the last Democracy Summit, and several recommendations specifically dedicated to the transnational repression, which I consider as extremely and highly encouraging step. Couple of recommendations that I want to cite very quickly. The countries should establish clear procedures for the public to report to the relevant domestic authorities if there would be any signs of transnational repression, such as threats, harassment, and the like. These governments should ensure that the domestic laws provide officials with the authority and tools needed to go after the perpetrators of the transnational repression. These governments should also increase accountability for whoever engages in transnational repression, and there are different ways. There are different ways of such as diplomatic consequences and the like, sanctions measures and the like. I think two of the most important recommendations coming out of this summit that I want to repeat are as follows. The governments should take into account the country's transnational repression histories and practices when and if they sign bilateral agreements such as security arrangements, extradition treaties, foreign aid. I think this also recommendation also reflects what Bridget mentioned, in terms of the arms deal and the like. Imposing export control mechanisms to restrict misuse of surveillance technologies, I think, could be a key step, an effective step to prevent, for example, digital transnational repression and other kinds of repression methods. One of the things that also was mentioned during the previous presentations is what I call awareness gap, and this could vary from institutions to institutions. Could be government institutions, could be public, private institutions. I think lack of awareness, or the level of awareness that we want among the local law enforcement agencies, especially like in the United States, having a very complex and fragmented structures, a need for developing a level of awareness and common practices is crucial, is very, very critical, because as also Bridget mentioned, the initial contact usually is going to be between the victim and the local police agency. And if there is no or a very limited awareness at that level, I think that the issue may not reach to the relevant authorities. So I think that is a very crucial step to follow. And especially when it comes to law enforcement agencies, it is not just limited to the police. I think immigration officers should also be informed about potential risks of transnational repression against refugees and asylum seekers. And information sharing at every level, for example, in the United States, from local to state to federal, is a very crucial component of an effective measure against transnational repression. My final comment, I want to just briefly mention, is the role of civil society. Again, victims or victims' relatives, share the same social settings among the diaspora or communities. So the public should be educated, should be informed about the risks of transnational repression. We have established, practices. For example, there are certain established practices and methodologies against human trafficking. There are certain awareness programs we use against human trafficking. I think such established practices could be used as a model to educate, to inform the public, so that they would be also part of this effort. I think victims and victim advocates should be encouraged to speak out, to reach out. That would be a very crucial component of, again, efforts to raise awareness among both the government and the societies. As an academic, I think we have a responsibility to do more, and thanks to people like Edward and Freedom House, the efforts you made are very crucial and invaluable. I think we need to do more, and especially the media could also be a very important component in this process, to make sure that the public would know what is going on, and that should also, I think, put in a way positive pressure on the lawmakers to take this very, very seriously. Thank you again for your time, and if there is any questions or any questions, I would be happy to answer.
Suleiman, thank you so much for your comprehensive overview of loopholes and also policy recommendations. So it is, as you mentioned, there is no perfect policy, but we need a kind of Swiss cheese approach, having different layers so we can be able to successful and mitigate the problem. And I'm going to open the floor for questions, Q&A, and for our audience, please feel free to enter your questions. And also for our panel, please feel free to unmute yourself and jump in if you want to answer any questions. So there is one question I want to start answering it, because it's saying, do you think TNR will keep on increasing in coming years? I can easily say, especially when you look at the Freedom House data, the data from Oxford Society, so it is increasing, right? So it is a kind of indicator that this is a growing trend. And also when we see the expansion of the opportunities, especially with the digital transnational repression, and then these perpetrators are out of sight and out of reach, so there's not so much deterrence. So it seems to be being a growing trend in the future. And another question that comes from our audience about the awareness. We talk about this, I think, in every presentation, and the question specifically about what the US is doing, especially among the victims, for the victims, and also among the law enforcement, and how US can actually help to raise awareness in other Western democratic countries. So I think this is a question especially Bridget or Katie can answer for us.
Sure, and I think this is also related to another question we have about Five Eye partners and coordinating with them. So, we heard during the course of our audit, there were quite a few avenues that agencies are taking to try to both raise awareness with other countries, our allies, as well as share information. So we know that, the DHS is sharing some of these assessments, including that assessment that we looked at, that 2022, with some of our partners. And then we also know that DHS just recently announced a new facilitated group looking specifically at cybersecurity. They just announced that earlier last year, and that is an internationally focused group. And State Department and DOJ also provided some examples of things that they are doing to try to increase awareness and cooperate with international partners, and particularly around trying to establish some sort of common definition so everybody is on the same page when they are discussing these sorts of issues. Katie, I don't know if you had anything else to add there.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add is that I think it's important to remember that some of our international partners are a little bit ahead of us as well. And so there are things that we can learn from them too, as some of them have, for instance, refugee espionage laws and things like that already on the books that we can learn from them. And so I think the information sharing and sort of lessons learned can go in both directions, not only from the US to our partners, but being open-minded to things that have worked in our partners' countries as well.
And just on the point that's been raised a number of times about need for a common understanding, I'm part of a working group on TNR, and there is an effort by New Lines Institute to develop some kind of common definition of TNR that will be socialized amongst different governments in the coming months. So there is an effort. Of course, it's very difficult to come up with a standard definition, but we've come up with some language so that we can get to that point of common understanding. And I think awareness raising has been one of the most, I think I said this previous panel I was on last year around policy issue. I think that's been one of the great achievements of transnational repression. As a term, it was only really coined in 2016, right, by Dana Moss, and it's only 8 years later, and we already have laws related to it. We have, we have working groups, we have lots, a wealth of research coupled with a wealth of people thinking about this from the policy side. So I think it's becoming a term that's being widely used and understood, and so I think that will help. But I think certainly more socialization at the local level is definitely needed.
Okay. So another question is pretty much related to US again. So do we share TNR information or intelligence with Five Eyes, like Australia, Canada, UK agencies who have TNR issues? For example, if the US detects that the government of Pakistan is targeting a Canadian soil, do we share that information with the Canadian government? It's much more specific question about.
Yeah, so just to caveat, in our specific audit, we did not talk to intelligence agencies, so we were restricted to state, DHS, DOD, DOJ, and Commerce also. But we do know from some of the assessments that we reviewed during our audit, such as DHS's assessments, that at least some of this information has been shared with Five Eye partners, including that assessment, that 2022 assessment that we reviewed in the report. So yeah, there is at least some activity in that space. Obviously, our report came out in October, so it was before this incident in Canada, but there were other examples of sharing.
Thank you, Richard. Another question is about Interpol, and there are like two questions related with Interpol and also international organizations like European Court of Human Rights. And the question is, how can we impose deter these organizations to be double-sided, hypocritical attitudes like not pretty much supporting the rights of victims of TNR. Okay, any insights on that?
I think Interpol, there has been a lot of discussions and rightfully there has been criticism about the Interpol's handling this situation. But I think there are a couple of things that can be done and to put pressure on the Interpol. But I think the United States, like Germany, like the United Kingdom, these countries could lead an effort to establish or to add more mechanisms to make sure that governments like China, Russia, Iran, or Turkey or others would not abuse the system. Sometimes we end up discussing many proposals, right? But to make them a reality, to realize these policy recommendations, I think we need a leading country. In this case, I think the United States can do more to push for additional mechanisms to again and again to avoid abusing, to prevent these countries from abusing Interpol mechanisms. It takes time, but I think we need to be very patient and we need to be persistent in following the right steps until such changes are made.
Yeah, I think on Interpol, I think there's still this persistent kind of law enforcement culture, right? That I think there's a kind of acceptance that in order to catch, and there was a documentary on this from 60 Minutes. It's on YouTube, published about a week ago, about Interpol, abuse of Interpol. And they interviewed the head of Interpol, Jürgen Stock, and I think there's still this assumption that if we're going to catch the bad guys, unfortunately, there's going to be some collateral damage, right? And some people are going to get caught up and targeted in ways that violate Interpol's constitution, that prohibits people being targeted for political, racial, religious reasons. And so I think that abiding culture, despite the efforts to reform this organization, introduce some new mechanisms to try and check these red notices that are sent out to request people's arrest, efforts to allow those with refugee or asylum status to petition to have their red notices removed. I think there's this cultural issue, and then there's an issue of capacity. Interpol staff cannot deal with the volume of information being processed through its databases by countries like Turkey and China and elsewhere. And I think there's a need potentially to try and bring in more external expertise, convene working groups to review some of these red notices. But I guess because of the secretive nature of much of the data and the work they're doing, that would be a challenge. But I think certainly Interpol, although it's recognized some of the problems and made some steps towards improving its reputation, there's also an issue I think that was raised in another question related to the leadership of Interpol, the current president being former deputy minister of internal affairs in the UAE, linked to various human rights abuses and torture when he was in that ministry. I think having people in those kind of positions of leadership gives the message that these kind of practices are acceptable. And I think democratic states within Interpol can certainly do more to coordinate to ensure that people from rule of law constituencies are elected to leadership positions and try and push for more reforms.
Thanks. So yeah, I agree that it's so important for legitimacy for these organizations, and their reputation really matters, especially for collaboration. And I agree with you all, and also Süleyman mentioned his presentation that we really need a kind of a strong oversight, independent and strong oversight over these requests from these regimes, and also how Interpol take care of these requests. So there is another question about NATO. We haven't discussed this earlier, but and asking about what is the role of NATO, the alliance, the Western alliance that also includes Turkey, which is one of the perpetrator of TNR. So how can actually member states can employ and promote democratic values in the face of transnational repression? I think this is a question that Süleyman can provide some initial insights.
Yeah. I think it's a very good question. From the first look, it may seem that the NATO may not have a role in this, but I think there are other areas, other issues where NATO initially stayed away from, but eventually they claimed the ownership of, so to speak. They made efforts to address issues, and transnational repression has a component of counter-espionage, engaging in espionage activities in the target countries, and mainly now most of these countries are NATO members. I think such countries, again, the United States and many European countries, could bring that to the meetings at NATO and to again create an awareness. I think every international entity platform could be a mechanism to inform the members about transnational repression and the concerns. At the same time, they could also again, inform them about what they are doing to respond to transnational repression. So such platforms could facilitate these communications, but at the same time, eventually, I think NATO is going to come up with an official statement to make sure that transnational repression is taken very seriously. So, as a military alliance, yes, transnational repression is maybe not within their jurisdiction, but by practice, by the outcome of these activities of authoritarian regimes targeting the citizens of these countries, some of them are the citizens of these countries. So I think it should be expected that sooner or later they are going to bring that up during the official meetings, meaning there will be some follow-up steps after that.
Thank you, Suleiman. So I just want to move on to the last question that I have on my list. It's from Kimberly, and she's actually referring to two pending bills. And one of them is Transnational Repression Policy Act, and the other one is Stop Transnational Repression Act. Anybody has any insights on that?
I believe at least one of these might be a bill to criminalize transnational repression, and then I think another, I'm not sure if it's one of these, but at least another bill that's been introduced in Congress at least a couple of times calls for, a strategy for agencies. So, some of these definitely do speak to some of the concerns and recommendations that we have made. I think it's promising that there are, these are just two bills. There are many bills, so it does seem like it is definitely gaining traction on the Hill, and a lot of these are bipartisan, so that's another a good sign for these.
Thank you, Bridget.
I can just add that we've seen a few bills in previous Congresses as well that haven't managed to pass, and so we're watching these to see if they make it through the process this time, and if they don't in this calendar year, whether or not they would be reintroduced in the new Congress is just something that we're keeping an eye on as well.
Thank you, Katie. And also there was a question about whether these PowerPoints will be available. As the members of Orion, we can share by email. So yeah, thank you. So we're going to actually collect together, and then we are going to send our participants. And thank you so much for our speakers and for our audience and for the excellent questions. And thanks again for Orion Policy Institute and Government Accountability Office for this timely and very significant event. Goodbye and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.